Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's FLAVA webinar, 2021 Virginia World Language Updates with Dr. Lisa Harris. Committed to highly quality and relevant world language education, Dr. Harris is the Virginia Department of Education Specialist for World Language and International Education, and she's with us today to share the revised Virginia World Languages Standards of Learning. The World Languages Standards of Learning, SOL, are the foundation of language learning programs in Virginia. In this workshop, Dr. Harris will share the 2021 World Language SOL, including background and a crosswalk of changes. Participants will gain an understanding of the new proficiency-oriented framework and strategies for incorporating the new standards in curriculum, assessments, and daily planning. It is an honor to introduce to you our specialist for world languages and international education from the Virginia Department of Education, Dr. Lisa Harris.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's so great to see you here. I'm really happy to be with this FLAVA workshop this evening to be able to share some information about our 2021 revised World Language Standards of Learning for Virginia. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the screen so that you can see the information we'll be sharing. And we're going to give you some opportunities to participate as well. So hang on for that and we'll go ahead and get started. The first thing I'd like you to do is go ahead and start introducing yourselves. And I'd like you to use the chat box to let us know who you are, where you're located, what languages you teach or what you supervise, and anything you'd like to share about yourself. I'm also going to encourage you to use the chat box to interact with each other throughout this presentation, to share ideas and to respond to others, and also to pose any questions that you would like to have answered either during a question break or at the end of the presentation. A focus for today is going to be learning a little bit more about the revised World Language Standards of Learning that were adopted in March of 2021. And we will talk a little bit about what they look like, the framework, as well as that new strand that is incorporated into the standards, that communicative literacy strand. And we'll share a little about some resources that are in the works to help with that implementation process. So to get us started, the first thing I want to do is find out what you already know. We have been doing some presentations. Perhaps you've had an opportunity to attend one of them. Perhaps you've already started looking at the standards to see how you can use them. But I'd really like to get an idea of where you are on your path to understanding the 2021 World Language Standards of Learning. So take a look at these 5 statements, and I'm going to ask you to identify in the poll question that Heidi's going to launch for us, the letter that best represents your current location. Where are you on that path to understanding? So if this is the first time you're hearing about new SOL, you don't know, you didn't realize there were, you would be at this very starting point for A. If you're early on in your learning about the standards, you'll be at point B. You've heard about them yet, but haven't really looked at them or started to get to know them. If you're at point C, you can see you've got a good chunk of the road behind you already. And that means that you have started reviewing the standards. You've perhaps attended a session or two about the new standards, but you still have some questions before you get started. If you're at point D, you are already starting to implement the standards. You are using them either in your curriculum planning or in your lesson planning or in the conversations about how you'll be moving forward with aligning to the standards. And then finally, if you are at point E, you have got a pretty good understanding of these revised SOLs. You've learned enough about them and used them enough that you've got some tips to share that you've learned along the way. So just take a moment and go ahead and mark your letter. Where are you on this understanding of the revised standards? And we'll give you about 20 seconds or so to go ahead and complete that. I see we've already started with the answers. We're up to about 75%. So go ahead and take another moment and mark your current. And if you're in between, that's okay. Just click the one that represents the most closely where you're at in this understanding. We'll go about another another 15 seconds. We're up to about 84%. So we just have a few more people to wait for to go ahead and respond. And we may not get everyone. If you are one of those who are on the accessing by phone, perhaps you won't be able to participate in the poll. But for those of you who are, we'll go about 5 more seconds. And we're up over 90%. So Heidi, if you would go ahead and close the poll for us and show the results. And let's take a look at where you are. Well, we've got a good spread of understanding here. So we actually have a few folks who are saying that they are new to the standards. They didn't even realize we had them. So that's the closest point for you. Hopefully we can get you started on seeing what those new standards are. We have quite a few who say they've learned or they've heard about the new world language standards, but haven't really looked at them yet or been able to do anything with them. So again, we'll work to address those items for you. I'm happy to see that we do have about 19% of you who say you have already looked at or attended a training session on the standards, and another 21% who've started using them. That is great. And we even have one brave soul who has said they have some really good understanding. I'm so happy to see that because we're going to call on you to share some of those tips. But maybe a few of you put yourself in an earlier one, might want to go up into that. I actually have a pretty good understanding one if you think. So we're not going to call you individually on the spot, but we are going to give you a chance to participate at one of these levels. So we can go ahead and close the poll information out. And we're going to move on getting started. So in order to best meet the needs of the wide variety of understanding that we have among our participants, we're going to go ahead and break out a little bit. Now, because we're on a webinar, we don't really have breakout rooms. So we're going to use the chat box and a Google Doc to help break up and to sort of address some of these questions. So those of you who were at that A or B point in time, you're going to go ahead and stay here with the presentation. And the rest of you, if you want to mute, you can, or if you want to keep the sound on, that's fine. But we're going to ask you to go out into a Google Doc that will put the link in the chat box, and to work together in one of the groups, the one that best represents where your understanding is, to come up with some questions or tips to share. So if you relate to that C group, the ones that still had some questions before you could really get started, we're going to ask you to go into this Google document, go to the section that says Room C, and come up with 3 questions that will help you get started using the new standards. So you may have more than 3 people there, that's fine. You can start typing them. You can talk to each other in the chat box about them and work together. This would work a little better if we had breakout rooms, but I think we can do it just by going to that document. And if you come up with more than 3 questions, that's fine. Feel free to add additional ones, or if you like a question that somebody else is typing, it's fine to just go with those initial 3. But I'd like you to come up with 3 at least in that area. And you'll do the same thing if you associated with either D or E. Try to come up with 3 questions for that checkpoint D that have come up as you've been working with the new standards. Questions that'll help you even improve the work that you're doing. And then for group E, try to come up with 3 tips of lessons learned along the way that you've had as you started to work with these standards and really got to that point where you understand them well. Okay, so if you've got a good comfort level there, and feel free to put questions in the chat if you have them, but I'm going to ask you to go ahead and go out to that Google Doc that Heidi has put the link in the chat box, and go ahead and start typing on there, thinking of those questions that you can add to it. And then we'll use that to come back to after I share some information with those folks who are still at that A and B checkpoint, so you can start getting to know these standards. Okay, so that's how we're going to proceed. All right, so for those of you who are looking to get an understanding of the new standards, in March, the Board of Education did approve our change, And one of the first things that you'll notice if you have previously worked with the 24 standards of learning is that we are no longer aligning to individual course levels, which means there's no longer language 1, language 2, language 3, but rather our standards are now separated by proficiency levels. And so you'll see standards for novice, intermediate, and advanced level learners. And we'll show a little bit more of what that looks like as we go along. Another change that you'll notice is we no longer have individual languages broken out for the standards, but rather the standards is one group for everyone. And then we have them separated by the language families so that you can see progress indicators that best align to that language that you teach. Our standards in the past have been aligned to the actual 5 Cs, and they still are, but you will notice as you go through them that the focus is now strongly on the culture and communication connection to each other. So culture is listed within each of the communicative strands and modes of communication. And then we added an additional strand for literacy based on the modes of communication as well. Previously, you probably noticed that our standards really only applied to the secondary courses, starting with ones that give high school credit like French 1 or Spanish 2. Now we have standards that can be used across the spectrum with progress indicators that have been created for specific contexts. For example, ASL previously was only represented as a curriculum framework, but now they have a section that shows progress indicators for American Sign Language. We also have some other contexts included, including for dual language immersion programs, foreign language exploratory elementary programs, heritage language programs, etc. So different contexts have a way to see what it will look like in those types of courses. So the standards themselves, the layout is fairly simple. We start with the big picture benchmarks of novice, intermediate, and advanced. And then that is broken down under each of those benchmarks into the standards, followed by the progress indicators. And the progress indicators are further broken down into the sub-levels within each major proficiency level. So for the novice section, you'll see progress indicators for novice low, novice mid, and novice high. The way this will look, if you go to the basic SOL document, this is the text-based version, the one that's approved by the Board of Education, you'll see that we start with that mode of communication. So interpretive communication is the example you see on the screen. And then you see that big picture of the benchmarks. These are the specific statements of what learner looks like in that major level, both communicatively and culturally, what they can do within each of those major levels. Those benchmarks are then followed by the goals, which is a little bit more specificity than what's in the benchmark because it's broken down by the sub-levels, and you can see how they progress from the very beginning, novice low, up through the sub-levels as you move forward. Under the goals will then be your standard. And you'll notice that the standard is a whole number. So for this particular mode of communication, you see standard number 1, and then you'll see what that standard looks like at the 3 sub-levels. But again, it's a whole number. So you see that 1.NL, that tells you the standard for novice low in that mode of communication. And then you'll see the same thing for the additional sub-levels, novice mid, novice high. Underneath the standards, you'll then see sample progress indicators. And you're going to hear me stress this several times because it's very important that you know that these are examples. They are not prescribed, they are not required, and they are items that you can take and use as either a format to follow or a starting point to build off of. But they are not the items that are required. So they're there as samples. So the progress indicators you see in the beginning of the standards document are the ones for the modern world languages. So on this particular screenshot, you see the sample for the modern world languages at the novice low level for standard 1. And it's an example of what that learner performance might look like in the classroom. So another really big change that you'll need to get used to is what standards to look for as you are working with them. How do I align to the correct standards when I'm working on curriculum or writing my lesson plans and unit plans? And to do that, you'll need to have an understanding of the expectations for your students at different points in time. And so I'm going to show you some charts that will use this particular key to demonstrate some endpoints where we could reasonably expect students to get. And you'll see that they're both color-coded and they use the initials for the different sub-levels. So if you see NM, it means novice mid, or AM, advanced mid, etc. And so if you keep that key in mind, when you look at this chart, which you'll see in the modern world language section of the SOL document, you can see which standards you could reasonably expect your students to be able to reach for at certain points in time. So for example, if I am a teacher of level 2 Spanish, I would look at this chart and see that reasonably I could expect for my students to reach novice high in most areas, except for presentational speaking. And that one, I might have to spend a little bit more time in the novice mid. Now, a few things I want to point out about this chart. This is proficiency expectations, not your students' ability and performance. And so understanding that difference between performance and proficiency is key to understanding this chart. I might be able to come into your classroom in a level 1 or level 2 and see your students performing at an already novice high, or sometimes even an intermediate low or level in some areas. But they can do that on a topic that you've practiced in the classroom in the context that they're familiar with. These outcomes that are recommended are based on what students should be able to do with that language that you've practiced out in the real world in an authentic context. So if I've been working with students for 2 years, they've gone through 2 years of language studies, or somewhere around 280 hours for a typical school year amount of time to study. Students should reasonably be able to operate at that novice high level without you as a support mechanism. So outside the classroom, in an authentic situation where they don't have any of that practice opportunity or support network that comes into place with discussing things with students, the other classmates that I know, or having a teacher to assist, but rather what I can do on my own with that language without help. That's what these proficiency outcomes are. So they may look different than what the expectations are in your curriculum, because your curriculum might be focused on performance. But here we go back to looking at proficiency. We did hear a lot from our classical language teachers about wanting a better understanding of how these different standards apply to them. The important thing to remember for the classical languages is that the standards are the same, but the progression through them will vary significantly based on the type of program you have. So if you're teaching a traditional Latin program that is highly focused on interpretive reading, you would reasonably expect your students to progress much more quickly through interpretive reading, because that's where your focus is, and to get to higher levels there. Whereas they may move forward to a novice mid or a novice high level in some of the other areas, and then stay there for quite a while, because it's not a focus of the curriculum that you're working on. If you are working in a classical languages classroom that has a focus on oral communication, as some of our courses do, then your expectations might be different than what's in this chart. And that's fine. This is set based on pretty much a traditional Latin classroom, but your circumstances and context will affect what your expectations will be. Okay, so where do you find these new standards? So for those who hadn't heard of these before and you're not quite sure how to get started, here's where you go. The Virginia Department of Education website under the section called Testing and then Standards of Learning, and then you'll go to World Languages. You'll notice in the breadcrumbs in the URL, you're still going to see foreign language because all of those web changes still haven't taken place in the things behind it. Most of the text that you see will say world languages, but you might still find foreign language in some of those technical pieces like the URLs that you see listed. But on that page, you'll find both a Word and a PDF version of the text document. But in addition to that text document, we have another format you can see the standards in that you might find helpful particularly as a quick reference guide. And so that second red arrow that you see is pointing towards the resources page. And if you go to that page, you'll find a grid version of the standards where you can see how they progress across the levels all on one page. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what that looks like. So for example, here is a piece of the grid sample for the standards under interpersonal communication. And you can see that I've pulled out standard 6, and you can see that standard 6 is exchange information and ideas. And that is the same for all languages, all levels, regardless of what your context is. What's different is how it looks, both in the different major levels and in the sub levels. So going across the top, you can see the difference in how students are able to communicate in that way, what the text types are they can use, what the context is that they're able to operate in. And when you put that language function that's on the left column together with all those contexts and text types and other information that goes horizontally across the top, what you come up with is the standard for that particular sublevel. So you can see that standard 6 for a novice low learner is provide basic information on very familiar topics. And standards, as you know, are written to be broad because they're not a curriculum. They're what you base your curriculum off of. And so we'll give you some examples of what that might look like in context here in just a moment. If you go to this, the next page of that grid view, you'll see for each of those standards, there is also a set of sample progress indicators. And remember, just like I told you for the text-based version, when it has that number followed by a dot, no longer just the whole number, these are examples. So those numbers preceded by a dot indicate the progress indicators that you can use as is, you can use as a model, you can change completely, depending on what your context is. So these are just samples of what they might look like. So again, if you go back to that novice low, that progress indicator, one example of that might be to respond when asked the price of a lunch item. And that could be many, many other examples that you come up with based on whether you're doing a thematic unit or following a textbook-based program, or whatever you're using to develop your context for your curriculum. Okay, that was really fast and a lot of information. So I have to see if you were paying attention. So before I do that, I'm actually going to go off my screen share for a moment because I want to be able to go and see the document and see how they did. So we're going to take just a breath for a moment and be able to process everything that you heard. And I'm going to go and take a quick look at that Google Doc and see how our friends who were typing away, what they came up with. All right, I'm sorry, it's taking me a little bit to get it to come open here on my computer thinks it's a little late in the day too. Oh, I'm starting to see a good number of questions. Group D has come up with 3. Group E with 3 also. Group C is working on them. They've got 2 in there already. Awesome. So we are going to go ahead and keep that up. Please do keep working. We're going to come back to that in just a few moments and start working on those questions there. But in the meantime, I am going to go ahead and ask you all to stretch your minds and think about all of the information that was just presented. And of course, some of you will have a slightly advantage on that because you've already been participating either in past sessions or in some other way to see this information. But we're going to ask you to answer some questions about the standards, and we're going to do this as a waterfall. So to try to mitigate some of that advantage, I'm going to ask you to type your answers into the chat box, but don't hit the enter button. Don't send them until I say go. That way they'll all come cascading into the chat box and we will see all at once what your answers were, okay? So that's how we're going to do our waterfall. I'm going to show you the question. You'll type your answer, but don't hit send until I say go, okay? So here you are. Here are your quick check questions. Looking at these 7 statements in the chat box, type the numbers of each statement that is true. So if you think numbers 1, 3, 5, and 7 are true, you'll type in the chat 1, 3, 5, 7, but don't hit enter yet. Okay, so I'll give you a moment to read over these statements, think about which ones are true, and type that list in the chat. And I will go for about 30 seconds just to do a quick selection, and then we'll have you send your answers. Okay, go ahead and hold that enter. Don't hit them yet. Okay, you have about 10 seconds. And go. All right, let's see. Which statements do you think are true? Scrolling down here, I see a little bit of differences going on. I see a lot of 3, 5, 6. I see some 3, 5, 6, 7s. I see some 3, 4, 5, 6, 7s. 1, 3, 5, 6. So we've got quite a variety of answers on here. 3, 5, 6. 3, 5, and 6. Well, I will tell you that many of you have the right answer. Some of you have some right, but not, you didn't catch all of the true statements. So let's see how many of you got them correct. I'm going to show you the results. And as you can see, statements 3, 5, 6, and 7 are true. So statement number 1, the 2021 SOL are no longer based on course levels. Remember, I told you that's that new foundation, that they are now based on proficiency levels rather than course levels. And number 2, again, very important to remember that the progress indicators are not required elements as written. They are examples. And then finally, number 4, these standards are not just for secondary programs. They can be used in any context. And we've tried to provide some examples of what that would look like in as many of those different contexts as we could. So great job paying attention. Many of you had those correct 4 listed. 3, 5, 6, and 7 are all true statements. And I didn't mention it, but most of you got that there is no plan for a statewide world language SOL assessment. That is not something that is in the works or that we're looking to do. So no fear, new SOL does not mean a new required test. Okay, so Moving on a little bit, I wanted to share just very quickly a little bit about this strand on communicative literacy before we go to the questions that you came up with on that Google Doc. So that new C is one that might cause a little bit of confusion when you first look at it. So we want to just briefly touch on what that means to incorporate communicative literacy into your work. So here's an example of one of the standards: develop interpersonal literacy, and that's the standard. So just like the other standards, you can see it's very simple, but then we have what that looks like in different contexts. So when you look on the grid version, you'll see that little bit more of explanatory piece for them, but you'll notice one thing about all of the information under that develop interpersonal literacy, and that is that they are not whole numbers. Standard 15 is the only whole number. So that means the rest of this is all examples. So these are ways that you might incorporate interpersonal literacy into your work, but you don't have to stress about how do I meet every one of these items listed on here. These are examples, and they're things that most of you will be doing naturally as you develop the interpersonal mode of communication. You know that you're going to have your students communicate, react, and show interest. Well, these are some ways that that could be incorporated to show that literacy development as well. And it includes with some of those less tangible things, like not just being able to learn the vocabulary or have a conversation, but to be able to continue and extend conversations and what that might look like in different levels. And that you become more comprehensible. So while we might start out to where only somebody who is used to dealing with a language learner can understand what you're saying, as you progress through the levels, you increase that comprehensibility and clarity so that more and more people will be able to understand you. And you learn how to use those other cues to help with understanding. Things like gestures, facial expressions, and using repetition are all starting to be incorporated as we move through the levels. And this is what that looks like in the grid view. So as you can see, as I mentioned, going across the top, you can see that the standard is to develop interpersonal literacy. And in the novice low level, you start to see it's use interpersonal skills to interact and communicate effectively, all the way up through that advanced mid, which is where we stopped based on our thought that that's most likely the highest point that our students could reach at the K-12 level. And that sort of looks like using those interpersonal skills to interact, negotiate meaning, and communicate effectively, starting at those upper levels. Usually in the intermediate and advanced is where we expect to see that type of additional communication ability. But then again, you can see what some specific examples are of what that might look like. What you will notice in this section is that the progression is a little bit different than it is for the communication strands. And so we're going to take a closer look at what this one particular progression looks like so that you can see what I mean. So here you see up close that communicate, react, and show interest. And you can see that in the novice low and novice mid, they're pretty much the same thing. But in the novice high, you see that now I have just a little bit of different where I start to use not just familiar, relevant vocabulary, but culturally appropriate and relevant language and rehearsed or learned behaviors. And as I continue to progress, remember, these are examples of what it might look like, not the required piece. As I continue to move up through that progression, you'll notice that I start to add a little bit more complexity there. But then when I get to that intermediate high, something special happens. Now I not only start to use that rehearsed and learned behaviors, but now I begin to adjust my own language and my behavior as I start to internalize what that looks like. So that's one of those things you can't really test it. You can't really make it a curriculum point, but it's something that you observe and that you help students work towards, that beginning to adjust their language and behavior based on the situation and the need that they have and how the communication is taking place. And then even as we move from that intermediate into the advanced levels, you'll notice one more change. Do you see what word is missing that changes this from intermediate to advanced? I'll take a look in the chat and see if anybody's got an idea. Yes, Kelly, you are absolutely right. In the advanced levels, we take out that begin to adjust, and now it starts to become a natural part of what you do in your communication. You know enough about both the cultural appropriateness and the language levels to be able to adjust your language and behaviors as needed. And that's really one of the differences between the intermediate and the advanced level use of not just language, but also the intercultural communication piece. Okay, so that's where we are, and I'm going to go ahead and stop that screen share for a moment because I want to go back to the document that you've been working on in the teams, and we're going to take a little bit of time to discuss and go over the questions that you came up with, as well as some of the tips that you came up with. So I'm going to go ahead and share that. Stop the share and do a new one so I can pull that up. And hopefully this is big enough that you can see the words clearly. Let's see if I can make that just a little bigger. There we go. All right, so we're going to start with, so those of you who are, you've looked at the SOL, you're a little bit familiar, but you've still got some questions before you can get started. And so here's the question number one. What are the reasons why these changes are being made and why now? That's a great question. Moving towards proficiency has been a growing movement, not just in Virginia, but across the US. As we learn more and more about language acquisition, we start to focus more on what students can do with the language rather than focusing on learning about the language. So we've been moving away from that heavy focus on rules memorization or being able to give specifics about a grammar or a syntax point, and actually being able to use what the language was meant for, and that is to communicate. We're really trying to get away from that expectation that by the end of our high school language course that students are going to come out and say, I took 3 years of X and I can only say one thing. We really want to move away from that, but rather have students matriculate out of our courses and say, I'm able to have my needs met at a basic level. So even if I'm only coming out at a novice high, or perhaps even an intermediate low level, I can go out and I can get a taxi and have it take me to the place I want to go because I've practiced that communicatively, rather than I can only do that if it's written down in the context that I practiced in the classroom, or if there's a choice of A, B, or C answers to go along with it. So we really have put the heavy emphasis on using the language. So that's a great question. Thank you for that. And I hope that I answered that for you. But if I don't answer any of the questions you have, please know that I am open to hearing them, and you can contact me and I'm happy to discuss them as we go. So the second one, why are all the languages lumped together? Why is it assumption that all structures and grammar are similarly taught and comprehended? What a great question. So this is actually a very similar response to what it was for number one. Because we're not focusing on the grammar or the structures, and I'm not saying that these are not important, because they are, and they continue to be taught as needed to support the communication that you're developing. So the goals, the big picture outcome expectations are the same, regardless of the language that you're teaching. They may progress differently, and that's why you'll see in the standards, the progression charts will vary based on your context. So you see it varied for the classical languages. It will also it'll be varied for the level 3 and 4 difficulty languages that may take a little longer to develop the written structures or the other pieces. There's a variety of outcomes for contexts like dual language or for elementary. But the actual progression of language development is pretty consistent regardless of what the language is that you're learning. It's just the outcomes will vary based on the amount of time that you've spent on it, and some may vary. So again, this is one that I'm happy to talk with more about if you've got specific questions and how this gets incorporated into your particular course or what it looks like in your language. And it is that big shift, one of those big picture changes that's going to take all of us a while to be able to really wrap our minds around of what the change looks like and what it means for our day-to-day instructional practices. So those were great questions coming out of room C. I'm going to stop there for a moment so I can go look at the chat box and see if anybody wanted to provide any additional response to either of those questions. Please do that in the chat. I'll leave this so that we can see those two questions. I'm going to go here and see if we've got any additional thoughts. I know we have a lot of you out there who have already been working with this, and I'm not going to say I'm the one who has all the answers, because we have a lot of you who are already in the field using these, ready to get started. So please do feel free to include your thoughts as they pertain to any of the questions that we're going over. Okay, I'm not seeing anything new in the chat box right now. So I'm going to go ahead and go down. Oh, I'm sorry, Deanna, I didn't wait long enough on my teacher time. How soon are teachers expected to implement these? That's a great question too. So as with any time we have rolled out new standards for world languages, we know that it takes some time to go into implementation. And so this year, this 2021-2022, some school districts have chosen to go ahead and start incorporating them into curriculum, and that's fine. But our expectation was that this would really be your learning and development year, that you would start planning your training and your professional learning opportunities for teachers. You would get to know the standards and start looking at your curriculum to see what you would do. And then over the course of this year and into the summer, you'll start making those curriculum updates, so that by the fall of 2022, you should then be ready to start your rollout. And that rollout could take place different ways depending on your local decision. So if your local curriculum leaders decide you're going to do a full rollout, then you would do, all the languages at the same time and roll them out all at the same time. Most places, I suspect, will choose to begin their rollouts at level 1 courses and start to align them to those novice standards, and then move their way up in a progression over the course of 2 or 3 years. So it's not an expectation that you immediately are able to go and start aligning to these standards, but you might be doing a combination of the 2014 and the 2021 as you complete the rollout process. But by all means, everybody should have started their alignment over the course of this year and begin that rollout by the fall of the next school year. Okay, thank you for that question, Deanna. All right, so I'm going to go into room D. And again, I'm going to ask you if you have experience to help assist with this. Please do jump in, because we have a lot of you who have knowledge about this out there. So the first question that was put out in room D: how can the communicative literacy standards be used to help support school-wide literacy initiatives? Oh, that's a great question. So I think one of the ways that you could do this, and this might be ones where some of our curriculum leaders can jump in and say what they've done. But my thought is that you start to look at your English language arts literacy initiatives and look for where there's any parallels. So you'll see similar words, I think, in both the ELA standards as well as in some of your English learner standards and in other initiatives in your school. Things like being able to narrate and explain, you'll find throughout other literacy initiatives, as well as being able to interact, being able to make requests. You'll see certain words that we used in the literacy strands that might match up to things that are happening in other initiatives. And so you could go through and do that matchup as one way to support the efforts, both directions, both for what's happening in other courses to support your literacy initiatives, as well as for what you're doing to support the other school-wide initiatives outside the language field. I am going to ask that our language supervisors and others do jump in with answers to these. And I'm going to take the questions from this document and also add more to them and put them out as part of the FAQs too. So we'll be able to really deepen those responses. This is a great question that would be really useful to have responses from those who are actually in the school districts putting these into effect to be able to give some answers to. All right, we're going to look at number 2. Number 2, do the new standards still work with the former progress indicators? So I think when you look at those, you'll probably notice that we kept a lot of them and moved them into the appropriate proficiency level. So a lot of those progress indicators that you see will probably look familiar. So absolutely, many of those former progress indicators can still be used. Even if they weren't selected, it's quite possible that they could be. We just chose certain ones because we wanted to show how they carried across the entire spectrum. And we only had a limited number to choose from. But one of the things in the works is that we are going to be building a bank of additional progress indicators for all of the context areas. So you may see even many more of those come back in as we work to build those supplemental documents. We're going to try to build them with a thematic focus so that you can see what that might look like in different types of curriculum context. All right, the third question I see there, do we have any guidelines, pre-recorded seminars to help new teachers learn about how to implement the new standards? So where we're at right now is all of the sessions that we've presented on introducing the standards, as well as the ones that we did over the summer for some of those different elements on using them in curriculum and in assessment and the literacy piece have all been recorded. And they are all available on our World Language Wednesdays resource document. And so I will grab the link for that and put that in the chat box here in just a moment also. So those are available. We're also going to be working on new ones. And again, with whenever you send us those specific questions, we're going to try to make sure that we provide a resource for that either in written or in recorded form in some way. All right, so that's all I see for the questions. I do want to stop for a moment before we go to the tips. And thank you, Heidi, for finding that link for me. That World Language Wednesdays document is Heidi has put into the chat box. All right, so we're going to go ahead on in then to these tips that were shared. And these are from the folks who have already been successfully using in the classrooms and some tips that they have. Let's see what we've got. Tip number 1, use the grid view for an overview and to see how the standards change across proficiency sublevels. Absolutely, that's what that grid view was intended for, so that you can see where not only you fall in the continuum, but what would have happened before and what's coming up next, so that you can talk to your students about what they would need to do to level up. That is to move into the next proficiency sub-level or to move to the next major level from where they are. And so you can use that to share what some of the differences are in what they should be able to do on their own in order to keep developing their language proficiency. Excellent tip. Thank you for that one. See, for number 2, remember that the progress indicators are examples to clarify the standard. Exactly. Thank you for that. And again, I'd be reminding you a number of times that those progress indicators are examples, that what it might look like, but it may be different for your classroom lessons and your curriculum based on whatever the focus is for it. So if you're choosing a different thematic unit, or if you're following a course of studies that varies from the samples in there, that's fine. You can use them as that model to show what one would look like. And you can also use them as a starting point or just change them completely. They are clarifying examples. Thank you. And let's see, the last tip, the new SOL work very well with the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I have not seen this tip before, so thank you for sharing this. Help prepare learners to develop global competence. That is one of the lens that we asked our reviewers and our writers to work on as they developed examples, was to make sure that we were addressing different areas of global competence, of the needs to meet the profile of the graduate criteria. And so we did very deliberately try to include those within the development. So lots of ways to investigate perspectives. And there was some advice on here. Check out We Learning. The new SOL allow us to think of more real world purposes and real world audiences. Thank you for sharing that tip. I'm going to go ahead and stop that screen share, but you are welcome to continue to add to and review that. And I am going to ask, did anybody who shared a tip or a question want to expand on that? Because we can invite you on as the panelist to give any additional information. So if that's the case, go ahead and put that in the chat. And when we see it, we'll go ahead and bring you in as a panelist. So we had some great sessions at the FLAVA conference where we learned a little bit about how the standards can be used in other ways. And we're happy to have anybody who was here or who was at the FLAVA conference and wants to share some of that information to go ahead and jump in and share that as well. So I'm not going to call you out specifically, but please do, if you feel that you have something you'd like to share, go ahead and you can send it either privately to Heidi and she'll put you on, or just put it in the chat and we'll bring you on to go ahead and share that information. Okay, so we've got requests on there for someone in particular to come on. So if you're willing, please do go ahead and jump on in so that we can get those additional perspectives as well. All right. I'm going to go ahead and, while we're waiting to see if we've got a surprise mystery panelist going to come on board, I'm going to go ahead and go back to the screen and share a little bit more about what this means for curriculum development, because just a few things that we wanted to go over. And when we talk about developing a proficiency-oriented classroom, remember the only way students are going to meet these outcome expectations is if there is a concerted effort to include proficiency-oriented instruction in your classroom. And to do that, you've deliberately got to think about what would need to change. And some of the things that you may want to consider are, how are you incorporating all 4 skills? How are you going to ensure that students have a lot of time to practice in the 3 modes of communication? How are you going to ensure that culture is a driving force behind the language that you're discussing? How will you ensure that what you're talking about in class is preparing students for that real world context, for that use in an authentic situation? And how are you going to put your students at the center of the language that you are using? How are you going to make it relevant for them? And how are you going to make it applicable to their context? These are just a few things to consider as you're preparing for your curriculum. We did have a whole session over the summer talking about using curriculum. If you go to that World Language Wednesday document that Heidi put the link, you can go back and see the session where we actually talked in a little bit more detail about understanding by design and using that to develop your curriculum and your proficiency-oriented curriculum. Okay, right, so I am again going to go out of there for a moment because I think we do have a mystery speaker coming on board. So Jen, welcome to the panelist team. And I know that you had a request to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and mute and let you share a little bit about your work with the cultural investigations and interactions. And Jen, I can't hear you, so I don't know if you have your sound coming, or Heidi, I don't see a microphone next to Jen's name. So is there a sound?
It looks like she's unmuted, but we're not hearing her.
Okay, I think she may not be hooked up to the microphone because I don't see one showing on her next to her name. There's no microphone. So that may be a sound issue, and that's okay. Jen, if you get on, just interrupt and let us know that you've got it. So as we wrap up and we look to the end before we get Jen, just a little bit to remember, keep in mind that the standards of learning, they are not a teaching method, and they don't prescribe your classroom strategies or your instructional materials or your curriculum, but rather they are what you align to and use to help you in the development of that local curriculum and your lesson plans. While they do emphasize, the knowledge and the processes and skills that students should develop, they're not the content that you teach. You'll use these SOL to develop your local curriculum and to define more narrowly the content and structures that'll enable students to meet the standards that you've selected for them to work towards. So again, focusing on those skills rather than on the content in the standards. And when you go to your curriculum, then you'll focus more on the content and develop your assessments. So to get started, my final recommendations for you: read that introductory material in the standards document. It's a lot of important information in there. The team worked hard to make sure that the research behind the decisions was listed. There's information there to help understand the organizing strands and the integration processes, and to help you better be able to understand how those strands increase in complexity across the different levels. I recommend that you really become familiar with those benchmarks, because those are those big picture items that tell you what your students can do at those particular levels. It's important to know that so that you can keep your expectations of what students can do without your assistance in line with what they're actually able to do reasonably at the end of certain periods of time. And finally, as you're developing your individual lessons, remember that each unit and each lesson is not going to be teaching one standard, but rather you're going to be aligning to the standards, and you may be addressing more than one of them at any given time. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the presentation and the information. And so we're going to take just this last moment or two to allow you to put any questions you still have in the chat box of what you might like to know about this introductory session on the World Language Standards of Learning. So one last time, Jen, are you able to unmute?
I think I can talk. Can you hear me?
There, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, well, with 1 minute to go, I just wanted to say that I saw in the chat box so many people that I recognize your names. I'm glad everyone is here to learn the fantastic news that Virginia is ahead of the curve. The 2017 Assessful, Actful, Intercultural, Communicative, Can-Do statements are really at the forefront of what is happening in world language teaching and learning today. You have standards now that incorporate the investigate and the interact. So they're breaking down the culture standard into chunks of language and behavior and investigate. And I really think that this will be very fruitful for all of you. We're making it real for students. You now are I guess, propelled into the real world with students, and you can find ways to have them interact with native speakers, especially in a virtual environment. So if you ever have any questions about whether how to do this, how to connect with native speakers, even in languages that are not as simple as Spanish and French, please reach out to me. You can reach out to Heidi and Eric and Lisa as well, but I'm happy to talk to anybody one-on-one about this and the opportunities that are afforded all of us by these wonderful new standards.
Great. Thank you, Jen. I appreciate that. And for those of you who were signed up for the FLAVA conference, you can always go back to the SCED program once those videos are available and see the great presentation that Helen Small and Jen Carson did on incorporating the culture into your standards planning. So that was a great session that you'll have access to if you attended the FLAVA conference. So thank you all very much for staying with me this afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to share the work that we've done, and do feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have questions or if there's anything I can do to support your work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. Very informative, and I think everybody will be able to use all of this information to help us implement these new standards. Thank you, everybody.